If you were to ask a random person what the capital of Canada is, maybe perhaps in an Instagram story quiz, there's a non-zero chance they would probably answer Toronto. After all, it is the country's largest and arguably most influential city. And while people have likely also heard of cities by the likes of Montreal and Vancouver, the actual capital of Canada is the smaller but still sizable Ontarian city of Ottawa. So why is Ottawa the capital of Canada? By the way, since I don't currently have a sponsor for my videos, I just thought I'd quickly take the time to remind you about my merch store. It's just right there, linked down below, and you can support the channel and wear it too. Oh, and I also upload videos a few days early on my Patreon. Okay, back to the video. For those of you who haven't seen a JJ Mikkel video, there's one thing that's probably very important to know about Canada, at least for this video. Although it's kind of on the smaller end of things, it is, and for the longest time very much was, divided among two groups, East and West. That's largely in part because Canada was colonized by two different European powers. Around the turn of the 17th century, England and France started to set up colonies in North America, while England, and later Britain, mainly set up colonies along the mid-Atlantic coast, settling new cities such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The French primarily explored down the St. Lawrence River and ventured much further inland, settling Montreal and Quebec City, and even down the plains, propped up by the ever-so-lucrative fur trade, to the new cities of Saint Louis and New Orleans. Over the following decades, while Britain gained control over the Hudson Bay, France also continued to expand its colonies even further. The colonies in the New World would also occasionally fight each other depending on whatever the hell was going on back in Europe. Thus, when the 7 Years' War broke out from 1756 to 1763, the French colony ended up being conquered and absorbed by British America. The French and Indian War, as it is also known, had a lot of effects on the two powers, notably in France, which pretty much just exploded, and the 13 colonies, who declared and fought for their independence to create the United States of America. The colonies to the north, however, stayed with the British, indeed becoming home to many a regular sympathizer in the 13 colonies. The revolutionaries also tried to invade Quebec in 1775, but that didn't exactly work out. Fast forward 3/4 of a century, and the Canadian colonies were having a bit of a tough time determining where they really wanted their capital to be. Canada East and Canada West were united into the province of Canada in 1841, but its capital bounced around Kingston, Montreal, Toronto, and Quebec City seemingly every time the Emperor died. During the 1850s though, Canada was much more centered around these areas just above the US Northeast and Midwest, and so wasn't really spread out over North America as it is today. Or, well, in practice the US border, but still. Thus, the rivalry between Upper and Lower Canada was arguably stronger than ever, both naturally competing for greater influence. However, despite the modern politics of the area, this wasn't necessarily so much to do with French Catholic versus English Protestant politics, as French Quebecers at that time didn't exactly have all that much political sway in the region, but that's a whole other complicated history for a whole other time. This, however, didn't change the fact that there were two significant regions still fighting for greater influence. In 1856, the Legislative Council was brought forward to decide which of the 5 cities would become the permanent capital. And after 48 votes, no one could agree on a single city. Since that got them literally nowhere, it was decided in March 1857 that this would be a decision for Queen Victoria herself. Ottawa had been jockeying for the position of capital as well, and actually had a good deal of support in London, largely from Prince Albert and Governor General Sir Edmund Head, who had traveled to all 5 potential cities and concluded that Ottawa was probably the best fit. By the way, for those of you who live in republics, a Governor General is basically a colony or a country's local representative of the British monarch. It was thus decided that October that Ottawa would be the new and permanent capital of Canada. Ottawa, beforehand known as Bytown, was a somewhat smaller city, but had actually quite a lot going for it geographically. First, it's more or less equally distant from Canada's other major settlements of Kingston, Montreal, and Toronto, roughly 160 kilometers from each of the first two and 350 from Toronto. Second, it sat on the Ottawa River, which meant that it was just on the Ontarian side of the Ontario-Quebec border, kind of like how Washington, D.C. sits on the northern side of the Potomac River just across from Virginia. Lastly, it was also said to be easily shielded enough from attack from the US, as it was deep into the country. By Canadian standards, I guess. Ottawa was kind of a second-choice compromise, though Toronto and Montreal each held parliamentary meetings for 4 years afterwards, while everything in Ottawa was being built up to capital standards, with Ottawa finally holding parliament by 1866, when they got the fancy building to do so in. The following year, the new Dominion of Canada was proclaimed for Ottawa to be the capital of, and Canada continued to grow into the country it would eventually be today, now encompassing all 9 provinces and all 3 Arctic territories. Wait, hang on. All 10 provinces, I mean. That could really be an interesting video someday. Ottawa grew alongside Canada as well, as so did basically every other city in the country. Most notably, of course, Toronto and Montreal, who each grew and competed for the spot of the biggest city in Canada, as well as arguably being 2 of the most iconic and well-known. With that in mind, seeing as to how the political, economic, and cultural centers of a country can shift so much over time, perhaps it was best that a neutral location between the 2 was chosen after all. Thanks as always for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, consider helping it out in the rankings by giving it a like and sharing it. Follow my social media at KhAnubis, and support the channel through the merch store or through Patreon, or even just by subscribing to learn something new every Sunday.